Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the 7th part of GSA 100, Searching SharePoint. In this session, we'll learn how to use the GSA with SharePoint. We'll discuss the different ways that SharePoint can be used and how the GSA will need to be configured for each use case. SharePoint is a commonly used system. It's primarily intended to be used as a document management system for Microsoft Office users on corporate intranets. It allows those users to upload and share Office documents, include additional metadata, and set granular permissions for these documents. A single SharePoint environment can include multiple servers, multiple applications, and multiple individual sites. Most SharePoint servers are not crawlable by the GSA or other crawlers. SharePoint relies heavily on JavaScript and forms for navigation, and doesn't expose all the relevant metadata to crawlers. It is possible to develop crawlable SharePoint sites, and even public SharePoint sites, but these are not typical and require significant customization of SharePoint. As a result, a connector is usually needed to effectively index SharePoint content. Google provides a SharePoint connector, which can index SharePoint sites and content and send ACLs and group membership information to the GSA. In addition, Google provides extra tools that allow SharePoint users to use GSA search directly from within SharePoint itself. The connector supports modern versions of SharePoint from 2007 up. To configure the connector, we'll first have to know how SharePoint is deployed. Within a large SharePoint farm, you'll have to identify the specific web applications and sites to be indexed. You'll also have to identify how group membership is controlled. SharePoint can use Active Directory groups for authorization, and it can also use its own groups. If the GSA is going to use ACLs at serve time, it will have to determine group membership from one or both of these. SharePoint also supports different authentication mechanisms, and you'll have to identify which ones are enabled within your SharePoint environment. SharePoint uses integrated Windows authentication by default. This uses Kerberos if available, and NTLM if not. This is referred to in SharePoint documentation as Windows Classic Mode Authentication. Both can be configured for silent authentication. SharePoint also supports claims-based authentication, which can itself use HTML forms, SAML, or integrated Windows authentication. The connector does not support HTML forms or SAML authentication for SharePoint, so either Windows Classic Mode or claims-based with integrated Windows authentication must be enabled. The connector is available onboard the GSA and offboard. We recommend the use of the offboard connector in any production environment. The onboard connector isn't compatible with mirroring and isn't suitable for handling more than 500,000 documents. There is also a separate Active Directory Groups connector that you will need in order to get AD group memberships for the GSA as discussed in earlier training. Finally, you will also want to include the Gsa Resource Kit for SharePoint. This includes 3 components. First, it includes an ASP.NET web service called Google Services for SharePoint that the GSA can use to ask SharePoint questions. This component is required in 2 connector use cases. If you have multiple site collections, or you plan to use batch authorization, which we'll discuss later, you'll need this component. It also includes a web part that will replace the default search box in SharePoint templates with a new search box that points to the GSA. The third component is called the Saml Bridge for Windows. This is an authentication service that you may need if your SharePoint environment uses NTLM, or if you cannot Kerberize your GSA. The Gsa Resource Kit is typically installed on every SharePoint web front end. You can also install multiple connectors for load balancing or failover. We'll discuss this later in more advanced training. When installing the Resource Kit, you'll specify which components to install. For each component, you'll have to provide additional information. For the Google Services for SharePoint, you'll specify which site it should connect to and the credentials it should use. For the Saml Bridge, you'll provide a TCP port for the IIS virtual server it will use, and for the Google search box, you'll list the SharePoint sites that should include it, along with information about the GSA it should search against. If you're using the onboard connector, you can configure it by choosing Connector Manager 0 on the connector screen, choosing the SharePoint connector type, and fetching the configuration form. If you're using the offboard connector, download and run the connector installer onto a Windows or Linux machine you plan to use to run the connector. The installer will create a connector manager and install the connector software. If you want multiple connector managers, you can rerun the installer and use different TCP ports. Next, you're ready to configure the connector itself. Under Connectors, choose your connector manager, enter a connector name, and choose the SharePoint connector. Then, get the configuration form. The first section of the configuration form requires credentials. Make sure you use credentials that have access to all of the SharePoint content you want to index. If you plan to use ACLs, the account you use must have full read permissions within SharePoint. You'll typically use a SharePoint administrator account. This section also requires the home page of your SharePoint site and URL patterns that match the site content you want to index, just like you'd use to set up a regular crawl. You may enter more than one site and often will. List all sites you want in the Include URLs section. Farther down in the configuration form, you'll need to configure authorization handling. If you choose Authorization by Head Request, the connector will build a metadata and URL feed, and users will need to be authorized against each SharePoint document individually. If you choose Authorization by Connector, the connector will build a content feed and will perform batch authorization at serve time. Batch authorization requires that the Google Services for SharePoint component of the Resource Kit mentioned earlier be installed on the SharePoint server. Batch authorization performs much better at serve time than individual authorization using the head requester. Under those two radio buttons, there's a checkbox for authorization by ACL. If you check this, the connector will include ACLs in the feed. It is highly recommended that you use ACLs in order to achieve much faster authorization at serve time. You may also need to specify the format of user and group names so that they match how they're listed in Active Directory. There are several ways that group membership can be identified. One way to do this is with LDAP, but you can also use the Active Directory Groups connector, which can be set up separately to preload group membership into the GSA. It is highly recommended that you use the Active Directory Groups connector in order to get all groups. The SharePoint connector includes one instance of the AD Groups connector, as discussed in earlier training. You might also have SharePoint groups, and for that you can configure the SharePoint connector under Universal Login Auth Mechanisms to perform SharePoint group lookups. The connector can also index SharePoint user profiles. These can be used with expert search instead of LDAP records. With any documents indexed by the GSA, you must have a matching follow and crawl pattern. Depending on what you selected for authorization, you'll specify either a generic pattern for connector-provided content feeds, shown here as *Google connector : or the actual URL pattern that matches the documents. If it's the actual URL pattern, it might match one or more site collections. Within the connector configuration itself, you'll need to specify the actual URL patterns you want to include and exclude as described earlier. Depending on your SharePoint configuration, you may need to specify site aliases. These are commonly used with intranet SharePoint installations so that users don't have to enter fully qualified host names. The connector and GSA do require fully qualified host names, but the connector can rewrite the URLs to correspond to the friendly aliases familiar to users. The global namespace can be set to make sure group and user information is matched properly. The global namespace must point to a predefined credential group that will be used for authentication. The local namespace will match the connector name you entered prior to getting the configuration form. The global namespace will be used for any ACLs that are associated with Windows domain accounts, and the local namespace will be used for ACLs associated with local accounts. Once the connector has been configured, it should immediately start crawling SharePoint and building feeds. Check the feeds page to make sure that feeds are being submitted successfully. Next, make sure your SharePoint URLs show up in Index Diagnostics. If you're using ACLs, you should be able to see them here for the pages being indexed. You should be able to see both AD and SharePoint groups if you're using both. Once SharePoint content has been indexed, you should be able to run a secure search for it. You should be able to check serving logs and security manager logs to ensure that the right documents are being served. Let's take a look at setting up the SharePoint connector. Now, I've already got several connectors set up on my GSA. I've got the Active Directory Groups connector. I'm going to leave all of that intact. And the first place I'm going to go is actually to my SharePoint server. So on my SharePoint server, I've installed the Gsa Resource Kit for SharePoint. And we do have, under Google Services for SharePoint, a little tool to verify the installation. So I need to make sure that the batch authorization and all of the other features in Google Services for SharePoint will be available to my connector. So I'll go ahead and test that out right now. I'm going to put in the domain, username, and password that I plan to use from the connector to actually perform my content acquisition. And after a second, I should get a message back saying that it succeeded. Now, at this point, I'm ready to configure my GSA. So I'm going to go to Content Sources first. And the very first place I'm going to go is Start and Block URLs. And I want to make sure that I have my Google connector pattern. If I use the connector to build a content feed, which is what I'm going to do, I want to make sure that it sends the documents and that the GSA will accept those documents and index them. If I was building a metadata feed, I would need to add a pattern that actually matches my server, in this case shanghai.ad.learngsa.com, and I could be as specific as I want. I could include the port number, but I would need to make sure that either way, if I'm building either a metadata feed or if I'm building a content feed. In this case, I'm going to build a content feed, so I'll just use Google Connector. Now, I'll go up to my connectors, and from previous exercises, I have the Active Directory Groups connector. And if I'm using the AD Groups connector, I should make sure I use the SharePoint connector under the same connector manager. And of course, I want to use offboard connectors wherever possible. So I'll go ahead and choose Connector Manager 1, which I've previously set up. Connector Manager 1 supports all of the types that are on the built-in onboard connectors as well. So I'll go ahead and give this a name. And I'll choose SharePoint Connector. Then Get Configuration Form. Now at this point, I'm going to provide the start page, the home page of my SharePoint site. And I'm going to provide the domain, the username, and the password for the user that will perform the crawl. So the connector is going to perform the crawl for me. These are the credentials it's going to use. The connector supports My Site. My Site is a personalization option available in SharePoint. If you have a My Site URL, you can specify it here. And you'll also have to specify the URL patterns that you want to include. much like you specify start URLs and then follow and crawl patterns when you're crawling a regular website. In this case, I'm going to crawl 2 SharePoint sites, Shanghai AD LearnGSA.com 4001, 4002. I can also exclude patterns, again, just like our follow and crawl options and do not crawl options. If you're using site aliases, you can specify as many of those as you want. You'd specify the fully qualified source URL and the corresponding alias that would be served in the search results. The connector supports SharePoint's own built-in search visibility options. So you can have documents that are essentially hidden from search. If you are using SharePoint, you don't want them to be found yet. If you have draft or unpublished documents, you can control whether those will show up in search. Next, we get to the most important question, which is, how are we going to do authorization? And as a result, what kind of feed will be built? If we choose the first option, authorization by head request, the connector is going to build a metadata feed, and the GSA will end up having to crawl that content. In that case, we would need to set up follow and crawl patterns accordingly, and we would need to set up a crawler access rule or use Kerberos for crawling. Alternatively, we can choose authorization by connector. That will tell the connector to build a content feed. If I choose that and I do not check the authorization by ACL box, the content feed will not include ACLs, but at serve time, the GSA will be able to pass the user's identity to the connector, and the connector will be able to use a batch authorization service to find out which documents you can see. The batch authorization does perform significantly better than the head request, which has to ask once for each document. But the best choice is to use ACLs. If you're using ACLs, the connector will automatically gather up the ACLs for your SharePoint documents, and it will also collect group membership information from your SharePoint groups and optionally from your Active Directory groups. So you'll notice we have LDAP configuration settings here, and these are basically the same things that we have in the AD groups connector. So the SharePoint connector actually includes a single instance of the AD groups connector. So if you were just setting up SharePoint and you needed to work with AD groups, you would not have to set up the AD groups connector separately in a single domain environment. Now, I already have the AD groups connector set up, so I can skip this part. There's a whole bunch of settings here for that. And we talked about expert search in a previous unit. If you have SharePoint profiles, you can use the connector to index only those profiles, and they'll be stored in a separate collection. So this way you can use that as a repository for expert search instead of LDAP. Finally, if I scroll down to the bottom, I can click on Save. Now, immediately at that point, I should see a green light for my SharePoint connector. And if I go under Feeds, I should soon see a feed for my SharePoint connector. So here we have one that's in progress right now. And eventually all of my documents from SharePoint should be indexed. I can see it's an incremental feed. That tells me it is a content feed rather than a metadata feed. Now, if I'm going to have SharePoint group membership as opposed to Active Directory group membership, under Universal Login Auth Mechanisms, under Connectors, I would need to explicitly choose my SharePoint connector instead of my Active Directory connector. So this will actually use the SharePoint connector, and it will also get any data from the regular Active Directory connector, because they're both installed on the same connector manager and they're using the same database. So I've already got one for my AD connector. I'll just change that to my SharePoint connector. And this, just like the AD connector, can only be used for group lookup. But again, it'll be used for group lookup for SharePoint groups and AD groups. Now, I previously set up this GSA to work with Kerberos. So it is a Kerberized GSA. So if I go to my Kerberos tab, I can see all of that information is still enabled there. If I go to a user workstation, I'll need to make sure that my workstation is properly Kerberized for the site in question. So again, if I'm using Firefox, I'll need to make sure that my SharePoint site is added to my list of trusted URIs. And I should be able to test that by visiting the site directly. Now this shows me that silent authentication is working. We already know how to verify whether silent authentication uses Kerberos or NTLM. Now, we didn't have any trouble setting up our connector, but in some cases, you might have problems accessing the service, the Google services for SharePoint during the setup, and you can verify connectivity to that from a remote Kerberized or NTLM enabled machine as well. So the URL for that is going to look like this, _VTI_BIN/GS bulk authorization. So if I go to that, I should either be prompted for credentials if I'm not using silent authentication, or I should be able to access it directly using silent authentication. So this verifies that I can actually get to the service, and I can use this URL to verify that the GSA can get to the service. Again, if there's any trouble, I can actually take that URL and I can drop it into real-time diagnostics on the GSA. Now, at this point, I should be able to run a search. I'll go back to my GSA, take a look at the index, go to Index Diagnostics, and see what I have under my SharePoint connector. And I have several entries there. And for a given entry, I can select that entry, and I should be able to see the ACLs. Now, in this case, all of our ACLs, they can come from either SharePoint or they can come from Active Directory. In this case, you'll notice that I have ACLs that look like this. These are actually coming out of SharePoint. So again, I need to be able to support SharePoint group membership, and I need to be able to support Active Directory group membership. Okay, so at this point, I should be able to run a search. So I will go to the GSA. And just to make sure I'm getting results from SharePoint, I will look for results on the Shanghai server, and I'll make sure I choose Secure Search. And you'll notice I'm immediately getting results without being prompted. So clearly we're using silent authentication. And finally, I can go back to my admin console and I can go to serving logs. So I can see this last search that I've performed. I can see that authentication happens through Kerberos. I can see that the group lookup is being performed through the SharePoint connector, which in turn is also going to use the data from the AD Groups connector. This concludes our 8th presentation, Searching SharePoint. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 100 presentations.